Now, a granite mountain, a crowd of tens of thousands, a patriotic speech on America's 250th birthday, and buried inside it, three sentences that just rewrote the rules of this entire conflict in real time. If you think what was said at Mount Rushmore on July 4th was just a throwaway line at a rally, you have fundamentally misread how this president operates, how this war has been waged, and what those specific words communicated to every audience receiving them simultaneously in Washington, in Tehran, in Doha, in Beijing, in Jerusalem, and in every room where someone is trying to figure out what happens next. It is the 5th of July, 2026, the day after America's 250th birthday. Today, while hundreds of thousands of Iranian mourners are filling the streets of Tehran for the second day of a 6-day state funeral, chanting "Death to America" under red flags that symbolize the call for blood vengeance, the American president's words from last night are being clipped, translated, broadcast, and weaponized across every faction of Iranian politics simultaneously, not as propaganda, but as evidence. And depending on which faction is using it, the exact same three sentences are proving two completely opposite things at the same time. That is the specific kind of strategic communication that most people miss. So, let's not miss it. Standing beneath the carved granite faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln on the eve of the country's 250th birthday, the American president said this: "We knocked the hell out of Iran. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice." That was it. 3 sentences in a 8-minute speech. One brief mention of Iran in an address focused mostly on American history, ideology, and the midterm elections coming in November. And yet, those 3 sentences are now the single most analyzed piece of communication to come out of this conflict in weeks. Because each word in them was doing specific strategic work across multiple audiences simultaneously, and the audiences receiving it are not hearing the same message. The setting is not decoration, it is content. Mount Rushmore, on the eve of America's 250th birthday, is the most symbolically charged piece of real estate in American political geography. 4 presidents carved permanently into granite monuments to historical permanence. Standing beneath them to talk about Iran places the entire situation in a specific historical category. Not a crisis, not an ongoing challenge, not an uncertain negotiation, but a chapter already being consigned to the permanent record of things America prevailed over. This is not an accident. This is calculated. Now, I'm going to break this down completely because the gap between the official story and what's actually happening in the rooms we cannot see is where the real picture lives. Let's pull back and build the full picture with precision, because context is everything in strategic analysis. It is the 5th of July, 2026, exactly one day after America's 250th birthday. The nation is still buzzing from the celebrations, but the world's attention has already shifted to the Middle East. On the 17th of June, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding in Doha, Qatar. The agreement came with a strict 60-day implementation window. As of today, 25 days remain on that clock. Then came July 4th, America's quarter-millennium milestone. At Mount Rushmore, in front of a massive crowd and a global audience, the American president delivered a speech that was mostly focused on domestic history, national ideology, and the upcoming midterm elections. But buried inside it was a brief but devastating reference to Iran. 3 sentences. That's all it took. "We knocked the hell out of Iran. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice." The very next day today, Iran is in the middle of a 6-day state funeral for its former supreme leader. Hundreds of thousands of mourners have flooded the streets of Tehran. Red flags wave everywhere, symbolizing calls for blood vengeance. Chants of "Death to America" echo through the capital. The atmosphere is heavy with grief, anger, and political tension. Meanwhile, the Doha talks have been paused for the duration of the funeral, which is scheduled to conclude on July 9th. Behind the scenes, negotiators are still wrestling with implementation details, particularly on the nuclear file. And here is where the situation becomes even more critical. Satellite imagery analyzed as recently as this week shows continued vehicle activity at Pickaxe Mountain, a highly secretive nuclear-related facility located approximately 1 mile south of the Natanz complex, deep inside the Zagros mountain range. Construction at this site began in 2020. International inspectors have never been allowed inside. When the IAEA director inquired about it, Iranian officials reportedly responded, "It's none of your business." Iran currently holds approximately 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Weapons-grade uranium requires 90%. The gap is technically significant, but not insurmountable, especially with a facility that continues to see construction activity and refuses inspector access. Iran's parliament has even passed a law specifically prohibiting IAEA inspections of facilities struck during the conflict. On the diplomatic front, the contrast is striking. While the American president projects victory and dominance, Vice President Vance stated last week that discussions on the nuclear issue in Doha would start soon. Not that they had already started, but that they would begin in the near future. This subtle difference speaks volumes about the gap between public narrative and operational reality. Adding another layer of complexity, on the same day as the Mount Rushmore speech, Turkish President Erdogan publicly warned that the war-addicted Israeli government must not be allowed to sabotage the deal. As a NATO member positioning itself as a regional mediator, Turkey's open criticism of Israel, America's closest ally, highlights growing divisions within the Western alliance. Meanwhile, Israel's defense minister has once again declared Iran's new supreme leader marked for death. And the new supreme leader himself? According to multiple reports, including from the New York Times, he is recovering from severe injuries, awaiting a prosthetic leg, and was reportedly denied permission by his own security apparatus to attend his father's funeral out of fear of Israeli strikes. This is the tense, high-stakes environment in which those three sentences at Mount Rushmore were delivered. A nation celebrating its 250th birthday is projecting strength and finality. A grieving adversary is using the funeral to project defiance. And the clock on the 6-0-day agreement continues to tick. The stage is set. The actors are in position. What comes next in the remaining 25 days will determine whether this conflict moves toward genuine resolution or merely another chapter of managed ambiguity. Now, let's dissect the three sentences with surgical precision, because every single word was chosen deliberately and carries strategic weight far beyond what most casual observers realize. First sentence: we knocked the hell out of Iran. This is not casual rhetoric. The use of the past tense, past perfect, to be exact, is doing heavy lifting. It is not we are knocking, not we have been fighting, and certainly not we will defeat. It is we knocked completed action, finished business. In one stroke, the president linguistically placed an entire military campaign, one that is technically still producing active consequences on the ground, into the category of resolved historical events. A campaign that is still shaping ceasefire negotiations in Doha, still generating disputes over inspections at secret nuclear sites, and still being enforced by American naval assets that have not yet drawn down from the theater. All of it is now filed away as something already won. Second sentence: they're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. This is the characterization of a defeated party, not a sovereign negotiating partner pursuing national interests. Not even a resilient adversary. This is the language of total victory, describing Iranian diplomats and technical negotiators in Doha as desperate, broken, and eager for any form of relief. The phrase dying to settle evokes the image of a boxer on the ropes, barely standing, begging for the fight to end. It strips Iran of dignity and agency in the eyes of both domestic and international audiences. Third sentence, and perhaps the most geopolitically extraordinary: we gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. Here the grammar becomes even more revealing. Active voice. America is the subject. Iran is the object. The United States is positioning itself as the authority that granted Iran permission to mourn its own supreme leader on a schedule set by Washington. The word nice is delivered almost dismissively, casually, turning an extraordinary assertion of dominance into something that sounds almost folksy to the American audience. Of course we could have continued striking. Of course we could have pressed the advantage. But we chose not to because we are generous. Because we are the kind of superpower that gives you a week to bury your dead before we return to the business of finalizing your defeat. This is strategic communication at the highest level. The same three sentences are being heard differently by every audience. To the American public at Mount Rushmore and watching at home, a clear, triumphant declaration of victory. To the Iranian hardliners, an insult, a humiliation, fuel for their narrative of resistance. To the pragmatic factions in Tehran, a painful but undeniable confirmation of Iran's weakened position. To Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh, a signal of American confidence and willingness to dominate the narrative. To allies in the Indo-Pacific, reassurance about the credibility of American power. And then came the follow-up statement the next day with Axios, the one that landed like a second shockwave. The president acknowledged that during this funeral week, essentially the entire surviving senior leadership of Iran is gathered in one place. He stated calmly, "They are all there, one shot and we can take them all out. But we are not going to do that because then we would have nobody to negotiate with." This is not a threat delivered in anger. It is delivered as a casual, almost academic observation. America has the capability. America is choosing restraint not out of humanitarian concern or international law, but pure tactical calculation. The target is preserved only because it remains useful. This combination, the Mount Rushmore speech followed by the Axios comments, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of multi-audience signaling in modern geopolitics. The president is speaking to many rooms at once, and each room hears what it needs to hear, or fears to hear. The granite backdrop of Mount Rushmore was not decoration. It was the message itself. Permanence, strength, historical inevitability. By delivering these words in that setting, on that day, the administration sought to cement a narrative of decisive American victory into the national consciousness at the most emotionally receptive moment possible. This is how modern great power competition is fought, not just with missiles and sanctions, but with carefully chosen verbs, deliberate grammar, and symbolic venues. Now let's turn our attention to the most critical battlefield of all the internal political dynamics inside Iran itself. Because no matter how powerful the external pressure, the final outcome will be decided by who wins the internal struggle in Tehran. As of the 5th of July, 2026, Iran is fractured into three distinct centers of power, each with different priorities and levels of influence. First, the pragmatic faction. This includes the current president, the foreign minister, and moderate elements within parliament. Their primary goal is to close the deal in Doha as quickly as possible. They desperately need access to frozen assets, restored oil export revenues, and economic relief. Inflation is running near 70%. Food prices have skyrocketed. The regime's brutal crackdown on mass protests in December 2025 killed civilians and drove anger underground, but it did not eliminate the root causes. These pragmatists understand that without economic recovery, the regime's domestic legitimacy will continue to erode. Second, the hardline faction. This group consists of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC commanders, the conservative Padari parliamentary bloc, and ideological hardliners within the clerical establishment. They view the Memorandum of Understanding as national capitulation. They have already passed legislation banning IAEA inspections of bomb nuclear sites. For them, every American triumphalist statement, every perceived humiliation, serves as ammunition in their internal argument that any settlement with Washington equals surrender. Caught between these two poles is the new supreme leader, Mojtaba. His position is extraordinarily fragile. According to credible reports, including from the New York Times citing officials with direct knowledge, he is recovering from serious injuries sustained during the conflict. He is awaiting a prosthetic leg, has undergone hand surgery, and has additional plastic surgery planned for severe facial burns. Most significantly, Iranian security officials reportedly rejected his own request to attend his father's funeral, fearing Israeli assassination or tracking. 3 of his brothers appeared publicly today. He did not. The International Crisis Group's Iran director described his actual authority in stark terms. Mojtaba is not supreme. He might be leader in name, but he is subservient to the Revolutionary Guards because he owes them his position and the survival of the system. This power structure creates a dangerous paradox for the Doha process. The pragmatic faction is trying to negotiate a deal they may not have the authority to fully deliver. The hardline faction possesses both the will and the institutional power to block implementation, and the one figure theoretically capable of forcing alignment between them cannot even appear at his own father's state funeral. This is exactly where the Mount Rushmore speech becomes explosive. For the hardliners, the 3 sentences particularly, We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice, are pure humiliation fuel. They will clip it, translate it, and broadcast it relentlessly. The message is clear. Even your mourning period is granted by American generosity. The one-shot comment makes it worse even during the funeral. Washington is casually discussing the option of eliminating the entire assembled leadership, only refraining because it is tactically inconvenient. But here is the counterintuitive truth that most Western analysts are missing. The same speech may also be quietly serving the pragmatic faction's interests. In authoritarian systems, domestic political cover for painful compromises sometimes comes more effectively from the adversary's public triumph than from respectful diplomacy. The pragmatists can now point to the American president's own words and say to the hardliners, "This is how the world sees us." This is the position from which we are operating. Continued defiance means accepting this humiliation as permanent. The Mount Rushmore speech, therefore, is functioning as a double-edged sword, simultaneously strengthening the hardliners' emotional argument while providing the pragmatists with powerful external validation of Iran's weakened position. The outcome of this internal tug-of-war over the next 25 days is genuinely uncertain. Both effects are real. Both are operating simultaneously. And the new supreme leader's inability to project strength publicly only deepens the paralysis. This internal fracture, more than any external military factor, will likely determine whether the Doha Agreement becomes a genuine turning point or merely another piece of paper in a long history of failed diplomatic efforts. After following this conflict closely for months, I want to share something that goes beyond the surface analysis. In my view, this Mount Rushmore speech represents one of the most audacious and high-stakes strategic communication gambles I have seen in modern geopolitics. The American president is not simply declaring victory, he is deliberately using triumphalist language to reshape the psychological battlefield inside Iran itself. Here is my core insight. In authoritarian systems like Iran, domestic political cover for pragmatic but painful concessions often comes more effectively from the adversary's public display of dominance than from carefully calibrated diplomatic respect. By standing on that granite mountain and stating plainly that America has knocked the hell out of Iran, that Iran is dying to settle, and that even their mourning period was granted as an act of American generosity, the president has handed the pragmatic faction the strongest possible external validation of their argument that continued resistance is futile. However, this is also a dangerous double-edged sword. The same words provide the hardline factions with powerful humiliation fuel. In a society where national pride and resistance to foreign pressure are core elements of regime legitimacy, public degradation from the enemy can rally support for hardliners far more effectively than any internal propaganda. I believe the president is making a calculated bet that public American confidence will accelerate pragmatic accommodation inside Iran faster than it empowers hardline resistance. This is not an unreasonable gamble. History has shown cases where overwhelming displays of strength forced adversaries to accept difficult realities. But the counter risk is equally real, that this approach raises the political cost of any settlement for Iranian pragmatists, who must now defend a deal to a population that has just witnessed their leadership being publicly described as defeated and desperate. What strikes me most is the gap between the narrative of decisive victory being projected from Mount Rushmore and the messy, unresolved reality on the ground, particularly at Pickaxe Mountain, where construction continues and with the IAEA still locked out. This gap reveals something important about the administration's priorities. They appear more focused on securing a deal that can be sold domestically as victory, rather than one that delivers ironclad, verifiable nuclear security. This is not mere rhetoric. These are high-stakes calculations with real human and strategic consequences. The coming 25 days will reveal whether this was a masterstroke of strategic communication or a miscalculation that hardens Iranian resistance at the worst possible moment. The granite of Mount Rushmore is permanent, but the political reality in Tehran remains fluid, uncertain, and extremely dangerous. Let me lay out the three most plausible scenarios for the next 25 days. These are not guesses. They are based on observable facts, internal dynamics, and the current trajectory. Scenario 1. Best case, the pragmatic faction gains the upper hand. Using the Mount Rushmore speech as leverage, they convince key elements within the IRGC and the new supreme leader that continued defiance carries an unacceptable cost. Iran agrees to limited but meaningful IAEA access. The deal is signed before the 60-day window expires. The United States declares a major diplomatic victory, oil markets stabilize, and the administration strengthens its position ahead of the midterms. This is the outcome Washington is clearly pushing for. Scenario 2. Worst case. The hardline faction prevails. The humiliation from the Mount Rushmore rhetoric and the one-shot comment backfires, fueling nationalist resistance. Construction at Pickaxe Mountain accelerates. Iran refuses substantive inspections. The 60-day window expires without a meaningful agreement. This leads to renewed military pressure, possible Israeli strikes, and a dangerous new cycle of escalation before the end of July. The region moves closer to wider conflict. Scenario 3. Most likely case. A messy, ambiguous compromise emerges. Iran offers enough symbolic concessions on paper to allow the United States to claim victory. Some frozen assets are released and limited commercial shipping resumes through the Strait of Hormuz. However, key nuclear issues, especially verification at Pickaxe Mountain and the status of the enriched uranium stockpile, remain unresolved or kicked into vague follow-on negotiations. The deal is hailed publicly as a success, but the underlying proliferation risks are merely delayed rather than eliminated. This allows both sides to save face while buying time. The critical variable in all three scenarios is whether the pragmatic faction can translate external pressure into internal authority before the hardliners consolidate their position. The invisibility of the new supreme leader and the continued activity at Pickaxe Mountain suggest we are currently trending towards scenario 3, the path of managed ambiguity. The next 25 days will not just decide the fate of this agreement. They will determine whether the Mount Rushmore speech becomes remembered as strategic genius or a premature victory lap that ultimately hardened Iranian resistance at the worst possible moment. The implications of the Mount Rushmore speech and the events surrounding it extend far beyond the borders of Iran and the United States. This is a geopolitical earthquake, with aftershocks that will be felt across multiple continents. First, China is watching extremely closely. Beijing has massive economic stakes tied to Iranian oil and holds a signed $400 billion strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran. When the American president declares that Iran is a defeated party dying to settle, Chinese strategists are recalculating the value and reliability of their partnership with Iran. The disruption of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has already cost China in higher energy prices, delayed supply chains, and pressure on manufacturing exports. The one-shot comment also sends a clear signal about American operational confidence that Beijing must factor into its own planning regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea. Russia faces a similar dilemma. Moscow signed a $25 billion nuclear reactor agreement with Iran in September 2025. A weakened, economically desperate Iran is a far less valuable strategic partner than a defiant, nuclear threshold state capable of disrupting global energy flows. The Mount Rushmore framing forces Russia to reassess how effectively Iran can serve as a pressure point against Western interests. Turkey, a NATO member, has inserted itself directly into the picture. President Erdogan's public warning on July 4th that Israel must not be allowed to drown the region in the smell of gunpowder and blood, and his accusation that Israel is trying to sabotage the deal, revealed deep fractures within the Western alliance. Turkey is positioning itself as the region's indispensable mediator while openly criticizing America's closest ally. This creates an active operational complication for everyone trying to hold the Doha framework together. Saudi Arabia is quietly recalibrating. With Iran facing 70% inflation, the loss of key military commanders, and a supreme leader too injured to appear at his own father's funeral, Riyadh sees a fundamentally weaker regional rival than existed 18 months ago. The normalization process disrupted by the war is now being reevaluated against this new reality. The Mount Rushmore speech provides important data points for Saudi strategic planning. For European governments, the situation creates painful anxiety. Several NATO members criticize the American-Israeli campaign, yet Europe cannot afford another prolonged disruption of Gulf energy supplies. The near doubling of European gas prices during the previous blockade caused domestic political instability. European foreign ministers are now making urgent calls, trying to read whether American triumphalism signals genuine confidence in a successful deal or preparation for renewed pressure if talks collapse. In the Indo-Pacific, America's allies Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines are studying the Gulf situation carefully. The performance against Iran serves as a live demonstration of American extended deterrence. If Washington can impose its will on Iran so decisively, it strengthens credibility in Asia. But if the final deal proves weak or unenforceable, it could raise serious questions about long-term American commitment. Finally, we cannot ignore the Iranian people themselves. Beneath the controlled spectacle of the state funeral, a nation of 90 million contains enormous variation. Some genuinely mourn, others perform grief out of fear. Many watch silently from their homes, exhausted by months of war, economic collapse, and repression. When the Mount Rushmore clips reach them through VPNs and underground networks, reactions split sharply. Humiliation and anger for some, quiet acknowledgement of reality for others. The broader meaning is this: we are witnessing a contest between narrative victory and operational reality. The speech at Mount Rushmore has cemented a powerful story of American triumph for domestic and international audiences. But the continued construction at Pickaxe Mountain, the absence of IAEA inspectors, the invisible supreme leader, and the deep factional divisions in Tehran tell a more complicated story. The next 25 days will determine which version proves more enduring. The granite faces of Mount Rushmore stand silent and permanent, but the story they framed on July 4th remains unfinished. 3 sentences. One symbolic mountain. A grieving nation on the other side of the world. And 25 days left on a 60-day clock that will determine whether this conflict ends in genuine strategic achievement or managed ambiguity dressed as victory. Let me be direct. The American president has gambled that bold, triumphalist language will break the deadlock in Tehran faster than it hardens resistance. He has placed a clear narrative of victory into the American consciousness at the most emotionally powerful moment possible. But as we have seen, the gap between dying to settle and able to deliver is still dangerously wide. Pickaxe Mountain continues to show vehicle activity. IAEA inspectors remain locked out. Iran's new supreme leader could not even attend his father's funeral. Hardliners have fresh humiliation to weaponize. Pragmatists are racing against both the clock and their own limited authority. And the nuclear core of this entire conflict has yet to be seriously addressed in Doha. This is the real picture, not the polished official story, but the observable, often uncomfortable reality. In my assessment, the coming weeks will not produce a perfect resolution. They will likely produce a compromise that allows both sides to claim success while leaving critical issues unresolved. The true test will be whether the administration prioritizes a deal that looks good on paper and plays well politically, or one that delivers verifiable, enforceable constraints on Iran's nuclear ambitions. History will judge whether the Mount Rushmore speech was strategic mastery or a premature victory lap. The evidence right now suggests we should watch the satellite images of Pickaxe Mountain, the movements of Iran's supreme leader, and the fine print coming out of Doha far more carefully than the triumphant rhetoric. This is how great power competition works in the 21st century, not just with weapons, but with words carved into the public mind as deeply as presidents are carved into mountains. If you found this deep dive analysis valuable, I urge you to like this video, comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe the pragmatic faction in Iran can overcome the hardliners in the next 25 days? What do you think the final deal will actually look like? Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future in-depth breakdowns of fast-moving geopolitical events. We cut through the noise and go straight to what actually matters. The next 25 days will be decisive. Stay informed. Stay sharp. Thank you for watching. I'm U.S. War Report. Until next time, the truth is rarely comfortable, but it is always necessary.